it's nice to know that everybody's finding somebody to talk to, and that's part of why we have these things. I'm Tony Case. I got the dubious honor of introducing people tonight, but I'm with the Echo Building Guild Education Committee. We're called Education Committee. Anyway, so I would encourage you just to take a minute here to say hello to the person on either side of you. Just introduce yourself. Part of the value of these events is just to get to know who else is out there. As you know, the Echo Building Guild is a small but growing community, and so making connections is important. I want to first say thanks to everybody who's had a hand in putting this event together tonight. There's a lot of volunteers, and because we're a volunteer agency, I'd encourage you to stay after if you can, kind of help clean up and break the room down, and so that these hardworking volunteers aren't just left holding a bag at the end of the evening. We do have online audiences here, so there's a group listening from 21 Acres in Issaquah. There's also a group in Olympia, and there's a group in Denver, Colorado. So we're trying to get the word out and spread word about what we're doing as widely as possible. Let's see. So I think, Doug, do you have some announcements, anything like that you need to cover here?
Thanks. Sure. We actually have one last call item, and this is the last call for the Green Homes Tour sign up for your houses, okay?
Right, so how many of you have a green home that should be on the Green Home Tour? Nobody? Okay, well then the deadline is Friday in case you change your mind, but we'll want to see all of you on the free Green Home Tour April 31st and May 1st. Go to ecobuilding.org to get more information. If you want to sponsor the Green Home Tour, it's not too late. You have until April 7th, and either I can help you or Jenny Hines can help you, and we have lots of different sponsorship options available to fit your budget. So, and I'm also doing the green pages. I got to plug my own project. So we're going to be doing the green pages in October. This is total early bird rate, but if you want to get in, now's the time. Green pages at ecobuilding.org. Come straight to me and I'll help you out. Okay, thanks guys. Have a great show.
How about volunteering day of?
There's one more opportunity that Doug reminded me of. We're also looking for volunteers who want to be greeters at the 25 sites we have signed up so far. So if you're interested in that, go to nwgreenhometour.org. It's on the flyer over there. Okay? Is there anything else I'm supposed to say?
Nope.
Okay, thanks you guys.
Okay. One more housekeeping item, and many of you know me, and you know that I do the volunteer requests. What I'd like to do, how many of us is this your first time at a guild event? Okay, great. Well, we appreciate your coming, and hopefully, I know tonight's going to be very informational and engaging. I'd like to go ahead and pass around a volunteer awareness form that we have, and it'll tell you all the various opportunities if you would like to engage and become more involved with the guild. And then if you see any of them on here, feel free, there's a sign-up sheet with it, and we promise not to bug you or anything, but we'll get you the necessary information if you'd like to take the next steps and get involved with the guild, because there's a tremendous number of fun things that come out of this. With that, how many of us have been involved in some of the various committees on the guild? So if you take a look, and How many of you really had a good time and came back year after year? And hands stay up because we really do have a lot of fun. So.
Okay. Great. Let's see. So we do have some sponsors tonight. I want to just give a brief shout out to Dan Wildenhouse from 475 High Performance Building Supply over there in the back left. High Performance Building Supply provides cost-effective, low-impact materials for high-performance buildings. They also provide free knowledge resources and for a complete and properly installed solution. They love building science and they look forward to learning about your project goals while solving your challenges. Peter Sundgren from Green Home Solutions is back there on the right. There he is. They do all kinds of products for interiors, and we were hoping to have more of a presence for discussion about indoor air quality and indoor air qualities, basically, because I think there's, that's a concern. Peter is somebody that you could think of as a resource, so be sure and go see him. They're located on Nickerson, sort of by Seattle Pacific, and he's got some coupons for trade pricing. We also have Kinley Deller back in the center there. He's the waste reduction specialist for King County Green Tools. Green Tools program is designed to help all King County stakeholders green their built environment while addressing critical environmental issues such as global warming, habitat restoration, solid waste reduction, and community planning. So Green Tools provides technical assistance, hands-on training, and policy development through community partnerships. And Kinley focuses specifically on construction and demolition and recycling. So go see Kinley if you've got any questions about that. Last little announcement before I talk about the people. Next session is going to be the 4th Tuesday in April here. That would be April 27th, and that's on permaculture. So if you want more info on that presentation, go to www.ecobuilding.org. Okay, tonight's folks. Tom Schneider here is a partner in Building Envelope Innovations, that's BEI, based in Clackamas, Oregon. He's been developing and testing paints and membranes and sealants for over 30 years, and how each of these materials affects people's health and environment, including his children's, is critically important to him. And I want to give you just a short example of what I mean by that. A few years ago, Tom was contacted by the design team of the Bullet Center project in Seattle, and they were concerned that one of BEI's projects contained red list materials not allowed under the Living Building Challenge. Those of you who know what raise your hand if you know what the Living Building Challenge is. Okay, all right. The problem was that BEI's product contained a phthalate plasticizer, which is known to be an endocrine disruptor. And Tom had done some testing on a safe alternative to the phthalates, and BEI was able to produce a batch of his product, Cat 5, certified for the Bullet Center project. And at the same time, and on their own, BEI decided to eliminate those phthalates from their production altogether. So they not only introduced a safer product, but they eliminated a real exposure risk for their own production personnel and provided a safer atmosphere for their employees. So I guess what I think is really interesting and key about this is that this is a change for the better that took place without legislation or lawyers or fights or threats, and it's really forced the industry to make better choices to keep up. So it's a real life example. And so with that, I'd like to have Tom give us an intro into the sticky subject of sealants.
Thank you all for being here. It is truly a privilege for me to get to speak to groups like this. I get to go around the country and speak to a variety of different organizations. Some of them I agree with, some of them I have not much in common with, and some of them I share a lot of very passionate subjects with. And because I saw so many hands go up when he asked how many people were new, I would like to mention and certainly remind the rest of them that it's obvious to, that what you get out of a meeting like this or an organization like this, certainly you'll get information from Sharon and I's presentations, and you'll have access to information about products from the sponsors in back. And that information and some of these products will lead to greener, more sustainable, saner construction, and certainly the industry could use it. And that's incredibly important. But I would suggest that, at least to me and a number of people that I know in this room and that are a part of the larger movement, the most important thing about any of these groups or meetings or presentations is the relationships that you end up with. You're sitting in a room with like-minded people that have in common the idea that things can be done better. We can complain and whine, but we are very reluctant to change. And that seems to be an issue. And at some point we have to embrace change and recognize that if things aren't acceptable or if we want something better, we have to make changes. And the project that Tony discussed, the Bullet Center project in Seattle, was an enormous opportunity for myself personally and our company corporately. And he didn't mention Proseco, our partner, a nationwide distributor of construction materials based in Kansas, that we've all corporately changed. That project and what it led to as far as other projects and further relationships really changed who we are. Our image changed, our designs for the future, and the people we involve ourselves with and who we partner with changed because of that project. And it starts in rooms like this, where somebody says, I have an issue with a product, or I have an application where there isn't a suitable product, or all the products that I've looked for to meet this application have either solvents or have materials in them that they're concerned about. If you voice those concerns to conscientious manufacturers, they are likely to develop a product that meets that need. If we don't say anything, if we don't ask, we won't get it. And oftentimes we have not because we ask not. So don't be afraid to go to your supplier, to go to manufacturers and demand better, demand more, or at least at the very least, demand a reasonable answer to your questions. And oftentimes there is reasonable answers, and oftentimes there's just gaps in the materials that are available. And it is up to typically small, very responsive, responsible manufacturers that can meet those demands. And we'll get into some of that as we talk about sealants. It is a sticky subject, and why are there so many sealants? Next slide, please. We can get, back one. Any time spent at Home Depot or any of the big box stores or a plumbing store or a D7 supply store, you walk in and there's rows and shelves of all these colorful tubes of sealant. And there are hundreds of them, literally. And they range from very cheap to very expensive, and they all have a specific application. And there are a reason why there are so many. For the same reason, and then I keep drilling this into my wife, why would I need so many fishing poles? Why don't you just have one? And it's because I gotta have 10. The same reason one of the guys here in the audience has so many boats. He has more boats than I do, and I have several boats. Why do you have so many golf clubs? Why don't you just carry one? You're trying to get the ball from here closer to the pin, just grab one and hit the dang ball. Each of those clubs is designed and tested and used for a specific place on the course to hit to the green. or into the cup. And for the very same reasons, there are thousands of different designs of boats with sails, with motors, with length, with short, that you stand on, you sit in, you can seat 12, or they go 100 miles an hour, or they just putt up and down the coastline. Every boat was designed with a specific application in mind, and so is every sealant. Every sealant, somebody sat down with a list of what it needed to do and picked the materials from their shelves in the lab and wrote down a formula and came up with a sealant. And in many cases, it's because there's a gap in the offerings, or there's a new technology that was developed that allowed us to exploit that technology for other applications. And that's typically what happens with most products, especially in the construction industry, where we end up taking materials that were meant for envelopes and hazmat suits and turn them into WRBs. There's those types of lateral expansion of materials that found new markets. From filling gaps in siding to hanging glass from 90-story buildings, there are sealants that, and we use the term sealant and adhesive almost conversely, because if it is a sealant, it must be an adhesive. It isn't going to be much of a sealant if it isn't adhering to the substrates, and we'll talk about that more as well. Next slide. Sealant, very simply, or not simply, is a substance used to block passage of fluids and gas through the surface or joints or openings in materials. Air, water, dust, sound, heat, pollutants, pressure are things that we wish to separate from one side of a building to the other, whether it's to the inside or to the outside or from room to room. These things, these gases and pollutants, don't typically transmit through materials, but at the interfaces where those materials come together with each other, whether it's two pieces of plywood or a piece of CMU and a piece of vinyl for a glass window frame. They're all different, and it's those interfaces is where those pollutants and air and sound and water and things get from one side to the other. A sealant at the interface must accommodate the differences in each of those materials. And it often comes up that materials are differentiated by the chemistry on the surface, or more importantly, in a sealant application, their relative expansion and contraction coefficient. If we have a vinyl window that when the sun hits it, and it's a bronze vinyl window, and it's a 10-foot wide window, it may stretch an inch. And so the opening has to be big enough to accommodate that, and if it isn't, something's got to give. It buckles and it won't open, or something breaks, or it doesn't work, or it's no longer performing the way everybody expected it to. So we have to accommodate that movement with the differentiation of the different materials. And to accommodate that movement, we have to have something attached to the structure and to that window frame that's going to accommodate that movement and still remain attached to both pieces and grow and shrink as the day progresses. It may go from 30 degrees below to 30 degrees above zero within a matter of an hour. When the sun comes up over the horizon and it hits a dark surface, that material starts to expand very rapidly, and the material that sealant's made up is going to decide whether a crack develops or something breaks, or if a gap comes up that is going to allow air and water into. Sealants must be applied under a variety of conditions: cold, heat, schedule, and talent. And everybody knows that we do not wait until everything's dry and 70 degrees. Especially in Seattle, we just sometimes have to build anyway, regardless of the weather conditions, and that may dictate what sealant is used, whether it is able to bond to wet substrates, whether it's going to cure in sub-freezing temperatures, or whether it can be rained on right away. Sealant materials also have the potential to harm body and the planet. We don't look at much about the sealant because it takes up so little part of the structure, but there are things about sealants that people might have sensitivities to, or the smell, or the solvent that's coming out of them may affect some people more, some people less. But probably more importantly is, where do the raw materials come from that make that sealant? What are the processes used to develop that sealant? How far was it shipped? And those issues are typically what's going to do harm to body and planet with regard to a sealant. I am not going to try and jam a week course on sealants and adhesives into a 20-minute presentation. There is a whole bunch of material that I could provide, and we could turn it into a week. And although I'm shy, as you might guess, I could turn all this into a week. We've just got a few minutes, so there will obviously be gaps. There will be information left out, and some of it may be even critical, and I invite you to contact me or the manufacturer of the sealants that you use to go after that information if you have questions. The sealants typically differentiate themselves by the base polymer that they are designed around. They are simply plastics. The sealant inside this tube is plastic, just like the tube is plastic. That is just one of the 300 million tons of plastics that North Americans consume every year. Some plastics you get, they're already cured, and they're milk jugs, they're sandwich bags, they're vinyl roofs, they are the dashboards, they're the gear shift knob. They are plastics, whether they're containers or toys or sealants or paints or a myriad of different things. They are plastics. They all started as a liquid. They all started as a fluid. When we introduced the fluid applied flashing and air barrier, people say, oh, I'm not sure about these fluids. I've not heard of fluids being used for these applications. And I point out that everything on the job site except for wood was fluid at some point. It was either cured prior to them getting it, or like the concrete, it went from a fluid to a solid on the site, and the liquid applied flashings and air barriers are just like the concrete. They are going to be converted from a liquid or a fluid to a solid on site. The plastic sheathing, the plastics and everything else in the building likely was a liquid in the factory. It was cured under heat or under a specific condition that turned it into a solid before you got to see it. Some of those base polymers are silicones, polyurethanes, STPEs, STPUs, polysulfides, acrylics, latex and butyls, and epoxy, and probably 20 other plastic base polymers that sealants are made of. And each of those polymers have a certain chemistry that is going to determine how fast they're going to cure, how waterproof they're going to be, how much they're going to stretch, and some of the other properties that we're going to break down in a couple slides. They differ in their properties, their curing mechanism, exposure limits, and risk. And each of them, just like a boat or a golf club, are different for a reason, and they provide their own advantages and limitations based on that. There just isn't one cure-all, cover-all, one-size-fits-all sealant. And if it was, it'd be too expensive to use. You just couldn't use it. So the list of properties that are critically important to a sealant, the first one is durometer. And that is simply a measure. Let's pretend this is a piece of rubber or a cured sealant. You poke a pin into it, and how much pressure does it take for that pin to go down a 1/4 inch? And if it's real low, if the pin just went in with hardly any pressure, it might be a 15 durometer sealant. If it takes a lot of pressure to poke that pin down, it might be a 50 durometer. And that's also referred to as modulus, or how tight or tough that sealant may be. And that is relative to some of its other properties as well, one being elongation. And that is a term just simply describing how far it'll stretch before it breaks. How far if you have a 1-inch piece of sealant, how far can you pull it before it breaks? And how much pressure did it take when that happened? And these are all properties that you can look up on ASTM. There's C795 or C75 975 that lists the different types of sealants and the properties that they would have to be certified as a specific sealant. Adhesion, obviously a sealant isn't going to do any good if it doesn't adhere to anything. And that is typically where sealants fail. They fail adhesively. There's two ways for a sealant to fail. It can come apart, like it ripped apart because the forces were too great when something shrunk. That's cohesive failure. If it simply pulled away from one of the substrates because the adhesion wasn't good enough, that's adhesive failure. And typically polymers, these sealants, they stick to a lot of things, but if you want the sealant to stick to glass, a inorganic material, and you also want it to stick to the vinyl window frame, and you want it to stick to wood, and you want it to stick to wet wood, and you want it to stick to 15 other things, we as chemists have to determine, how much we're willing to spend, how much we're willing to put into the formula that make it that are compatible with all the other components in there. Dow Corning, and I'll give you a brief history because it is so important. Dow Corning is a company made up from Dow Chemical and Corning Glass, and they formed a new company when fiberglass came out. And if you put fibers in with a liquid glass and it cures around those fibers, you can get very high modulus, bendy fishing poles, for instance. And none of that worked unless the epoxy or the polyester or the acrylic or whatever resin was used bonds to the glass. If that glass is loose in there, there's no strength. And there weren't, but almost nothing that would bond glass to organic polymers. They found, through purely by accident, in their manufacturing process of silicone, these tiny little molecules that were escaping into the atmosphere could be collected, and they are little guys that love organic on this end. They will grab the epoxy or polyester or nylon or vinyl or anything else. The other side of it loves glass or inorganic materials. And all of a sudden they had these things they call silanes. And I take those silanes and I'll put them in my formula so that my sealant, based on a organic polymer, will bond to an inorganic substrate. The issue with that is the moment that I put it in there, they're tiny little guys and they love some of the other materials in this tube. They start going away the moment I put it in there. And that's why there's a shelf life on sealants. Maybe it bonded to 100 things the day I made it. 6 months, enough of those little guys absorbed into the filler pigments, it only bonds to 30 things. And after 12 months, maybe it only bonds to 2 things. So it is critically important. If you leave here with only one thing tonight, look at your batch date of your sealant and make sure it is within the manufacturer's recommendations. If it isn't, don't spend any money on it. And even if it's towards the end, if you have a friendly supplier, tell them to go back and get the fresh stuff. That you're educated, you know why you want the fresh stuff. He can sell the stuff to somebody else that doesn't know why they need it. Adhesion is incredibly important. Obviously, resistance to weather. If it's going to be a sealant used on the exterior, it's going to be exposed to sunlight and water and heat and cold and pollutants and all kinds of other things. And that's going to, obviously, the more durable it is, the more resistant it is to some of these conditions, the more expensive it's likely to be. If you're going to use it inside and it's not going to be exposed to sunlight, you don't need the expensive chemicals that are in there to make it resistant. So you can save money. That lifespan, how long is it expected to live? Are you building a movie set that they're going to tear down in 6 months and you just need to keep the air out of between the panels? Or are you building a bullet center or your home? You're trying to protect an investment, so you want to match the life of the sealant to what you're expecting of it. And again, you're going to pay more for the longer lasting sealants. Real quick question.
Yeah, so the lifespan, I'm thinking, how, new products, how can we have a good sense of how long those new products will last, without getting too deep into it? I would imagine part of it is just the chemistry of the new product compared to the chemistry of what we know, but...
Correct, and that is an incredibly good question, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Typically, new products aren't developed for the specific application you're going to use them for. New products are typically developed from technology that was used in another industry. So you can go back and look at how those products performed in other industries exposed to the same things that you're going to ask it to be exposed to. If you start with I'm going to build a new sealant, and as it turns out, the people that make rail cars and trucks that go over the roads and go across the Rockies and go through all the same environmental conditions that my sealant's going to be under, that would give me some living history about how that product's going to perform. So that would be a typical example of how you might be able to predict the long-term performance of a new product. There's some things I can do as a chemist or as the lab rat. I can put it in a UV box and shower it with water and UV and say that, okay, 3 months of this in this UV box is equal to 10 years out in the field. Or I can send it down to southern Florida, aim it directly at the sun, and see how it compares over a month, say, to products that have been used for years. And we know everything degrades. We can kind of gauge how is it degrading compared to some of these other products. That's another way to give you some kind of a prediction on how new products are going to be, how they're going to perform in this new application. Compatibility. Obviously, these products are going to be attached to other things, and oftentimes they're going to be in connection to or in the presence of things that we didn't expect. People build things out of things I would, oh my gosh, where did they come up with that idea? So you would, in your selection of the sealant, you want to make sure, or as I'm designing the sealant, I want to make sure that isn't going to harm anything it's touching or anything that it might come in contact with. There are such things as sealants with solvents in them. And that typically solvents are in sealants for one reason. It is to reduce the viscosity so that you can squeeze it out of a tube and tool it into the joint. You're trying to reduce the viscosity, and some polymers, polyurethanes for instance, they're big long molecular weight chains of molecules, and they require solvent to get them to a point where you can work with them. Those solvents, and I'm required to put as least in there as possible, forcing me to use the stronger and stronger solvent. And now that strong solvent is in there, and if I go to put a peel and stick membrane over it, that solvent coming out of there for a very long time may dissolve that bituminous material connected to the peel and stick, for instance. And I'm not bashing anybody's products, I'm just coming up with examples of where different materials that we thought should be compatible end up not being compatible. So compatibility is obviously very important. The effect on the environment, and that may be, my partners are engaged in the process of fixing buildings. We don't build any new buildings, they just fix failed buildings, and that's why we have such a background in sealants and their failure mechanisms and why they would perform or not perform. So they are engaged in fixing buildings, and they try to keep the occupants in there. So they have to be very critical about looking at each of the materials so that they're not going to affect the inhabitants of the building. So the sealants do in fact have a environmental impact while they're being used, whether it's the guy applying it or the guy living in the space. I will say, as Tony mentioned earlier, typically the biggest exposure issue with sealants isn't going to have anything to do with the inhabitant or the applicator. It's going to have to do with my guy that makes it. He's standing over the batch. He's pouring these chemicals out of 5-gallon buckets into batches. He's standing over it all day. Does he need to wear a respirator? Does he need to wear a mask? Or can he smoke a cigarette while he's doing it? Those are all issues that probably have a bigger environmental health impact, is not to the end user or the people living in the building. It's the people that make it, or the people that make the raw materials that my guys are making the sealants out of. That's where we became very concerned, and that's why we decided to eliminate phthalates, not just from our Cat 5 for the Bullet Center, but from our factory. If we were concerned about our guys. I don't think any 3-year-old was gonna go eat the west elevation of the Bullitt Center and grow a third testicle. It just wasn't gonna happen. But my guys in the factory, they're exposed to it every day. And that's where we had to look at, what are we the people that will make this decision? And when we all raised our hands, I was pleasantly semi-surprised to find we were. We decided we were those people. Health and safety, I just went over that, the schedule. Contractors go out to a lot of buildings of different sizes and shapes and different schedules that they're trying to get this sealant to work under. And as it turns out, if you have a building and it's a summer day and you've got a 1/2-inch gap between the marble panels or whatever the cladding is, and you're filling that gap with sealant and tooling it and doing a very good job, and the sun's setting at 6:30 and you're taking stuff down the scaffolding and everything cools off and those panels shrink and they pull apart and that sealant hasn't cured yet, it may pull apart and fail before it ever cured. Or just the opposite. They start early in the morning and fill that gap with the sealant and the sun hits it and expands the panels and it's pushing all the sealant out before it cured. So in that instance, you would be forced to use something that cures very rapidly. And it might end up having to be a 2-part system where you're introducing the catalyst that's going to cross-link that polymer very rapidly so that you can be done before everything starts moving and failing the sealant before it's even had a chance to cure. The sequence of events on a job site. And I'm sure architects have a very nice list in their office of how things go. And I'm sure it was developed over hundreds of years. And the guys out in the field, or the superintendent, the project manager, this didn't show up on Tuesday, the guy's showing up on Wednesday to apply this, and we'll get to that later, and all of a sudden things get out of sequence. And that oftentimes forces what sealant is selected for that application. It just ends up being a matter of the sequence. And then there's cost. You know, that is an enormous issue, especially for the green builder, the sustainable builder. They're all well and good intentioned and they decide what they're going to do. They're going to build a passive house, they're going to build a living building challenge building, and then they get the bill and they're just going to stab themselves with a pencil. The cost. It's an issue, and things get de-engineered. People decide, well, I can get that at Home Depot cheaper, and it says right here on the data sheet, it's the same thing. Unless the folks that are passionate about really making changes in the industry understand why it's just more expensive to do things right. It just truly is. We've been doing it wrong for a lot of years, and almost every time, the reason we're doing it wrong is somebody's greedy. That is almost the case every time. It's either they're uneducated or just ignorant about the application of the sealant, but almost always it was somebody decided to do something cheaper. And that does not provide confidence in our industry. We have failures left and right. There's a reason you see so many buildings from any high spot in the city, why they're all wrapped in plastic and they're having to be stripped and reclad. It is usually down to a cost determination. And sealants come in different colors. You might want to match the brick or match the wife's shoes, whatever it comes down to. Some sealants can be colorized, some of them aren't compatible with different colorants, so you can be limited in that. And then the pot life. How fast does it cure? How long do I need to get this out of the container? If it's a 2-part system and I'm mixing it in a bucket, I may have 15 minutes, I may have 15 hours. That will be part of the selection process. Sealants, why so many and why do they fail? They fail. And the testament to that is oftentimes you walk into a building and take a big whiff and something's molding. Something's going bad. There's black wood behind the sheetrock. There is something going haywire with this building. And oftentimes it is a failure of the sealant. Whether they picked the wrong sealant, they picked the wrong time to do it, they picked the wrong guy to do it, they didn't do the surface preparation correctly, or it shrank too much, the application conditions, they didn't wait till it was dry, or they didn't wait till it was warm enough. But probably more often than not, They did not prep the surface correctly. They didn't clean the residue from the last sealant, or they didn't clean off the mil-spec oil that was on the aluminum. They just didn't get a clean surface for that material to bite into. And oftentimes there was just more movement than they anticipated, and things failed for that reason. And for that reason, they just maybe selected the wrong sealant. Next slide, please. Things move. As I mentioned before, you have expansion contraction coefficients of every different material. They all change, and with heat and cold and wind and high pressure, low pressure, things move. Buildings shrink as they settle, buildings shrink as they dry out, and we have to have sealants that are going to accommodate that movement. Next slide. The other critical thing about a sealant is the profile of the cured sealant. It is a 2-to-1 ratio of half as deep as it is wide, typically. There are sealants that are different, but that's the general rule of thumb. And you want to eliminate a third side adhesion. You just want it to bond to two sides, not in the center to something, because that will limit its movement characteristics. The profile, as I just mentioned, the three-sided adhesion, the time constraints, testing. We're a testing company, and our motto is, if we're not testing, we're guessing. And we're guessing. There is a lot of guessing. And people say, well, testing's expensive. Testing is expensive. Failure is incredibly expensive. And yet we just, oh my gosh, there's no cost for testing. It's a line item in the budget. And so there's a $4 million repair contract in 3 years because they didn't test the sealant. And there's a number of ways to test them. You can look up, and many of your suppliers provide that information or that testing service. The schedule, again, it goes down to how much time, and there's never enough. There just is, it should have been done yesterday, and now we're doing it this morning, and that means tomorrow's work's gonna have to be done on Friday, and that determines whether a sealant is gonna fail or perform. And again, it comes down to cost as well. You know, you got this great big 1-inch gap. What am I gonna fill that with? A $10 a tube sealant? Or am I gonna put the proper backing material in there and provide the right geometry for the profile of the sealant joint? Next slide. Adhesion. What causes it? It's the material's affinity for the material you're putting it on. They're either compatible, they either like each other or they don't. And they'll like each other a lot better if they have those silanes in there, and those silanes are still effective because they weren't absorbed into the interior of the sealant, because the shelf life is still intact. What prevents it? Dirty substrates, wet substrates, and all the other things that is listed typically on the data sheet, why or when it's allowable to apply different sealants. Why is adhesion important? And it's probably the second most important property of any sealant is its adhesion. How long is it going to hang on to both sides of that moving joint? And if that isn't important, then don't put it in there. Don't waste any time or expense of buying a sealant and applying it unless you know for certain it's going to bond to both sides for the period of time you're expecting the sealant to last. Next slide. The sun. The sun is our life. There would be no life without it. It is also our death. UV rays hit bonds of chemicals, and they break those bonds, and that's why paint's chalk. That's why sealant degrades. That's why cars oxidize. It's all because they're in the presence of sunlight, and that sunlight breaks apart the materials. So you will pick either the polymer that will resist that sun, or the chemicals that hold that polymer together are either sun resistant or they are not, or you're going to provide an additive to the polymer that reflects the sun. And that's why white is a typical sealant color, because titanium dioxide makes that sealant white, and it also reflects and absorbs the UV rays and keeps it lasting longer. There is a reason silica is the most abundant chemical on Earth. It's because the sun doesn't affect it. If everything's broken down to its last piece, it's usually silica. It's sand on the beach. All the mountains are made of it, and they don't go anywhere because the sun doesn't break it down. And that's why silicone is so long lasting, and that's why silyl terminated chemicals last longer than others, is because that silica is the basis for it performing. Next slide. Water, same thing. We get life from water. Water degrades construction materials, and sealants are one of them. Is my sealant going to withstand a 3-foot flood, a 3-inch flood? I don't know. My project may never be flooded. I may never have it exposed to the water. If I am, I need to pick a sealant that is water resistant. Next slide. All things have a lifespan, and just like you and I, sealants are going to die at some point. So it becomes critically important to decide, if I want the building to last 50 years, okay, I need the longest the sealant lasts is typically 20, 25 years. That means I'm going to have to replace it at some point in the lifespan of the building. And the sealant chemistry and the quality of that sealant is going to determine how long it lasts. And then you have to build in the cost of replacement. You can decide, okay, I don't need an STPE. I don't want to pay for a silicone. I'm going to use a cheaper organic material because it was cheaper. I can get it for $3 a tube instead of 10. The cost of that sealant is minuscule compared to digging all the old sealant out and replacing it. That we have to look at the true cost of replacement, and then you have to compare that cost of the sealant with the cost of failure. A $4 million strip and reclad, and they happen way too often, is oftentimes because somebody chinched on the sealant, or they had a 5-year schedule of replacement and there wasn't any maintenance budget, and so we overlooked it. Water intruded into the building and degraded the construction materials, and that's why we have failures. Next slide. We have a house, whether it's the one we live in or the building our office is in, or the buildings we drive by or we invest in through our retirement funds. We have to protect them, and what we protect them with will determine whether we get a return on that investment, whether it's a house or an office building that we invest in. And the sealants are going to play a role in how well we protect that investment. And that comes down again to selecting the right sealant, be willing to pay for it, and go out and make a new sealant if one doesn't exist for your specific application. And now we're going to get down to what's a responsible sealant. There's green sealants. There's sealants that say contain no chemicals of this sort or that sort, and I don't know that I trust any of it. I think that there is enough wiggle room in there to say all kinds of things about what's either in or is not in a sealant. And so where does that leave you when you want to be responsible? If you're the Green Building Eco Building Guild, if you're the Living Future Institute, or if you're a passive house and you're trying to be responsible, I think you can look beyond what's in the tube. You don't have to go to the data sheet or the MSDS. Certainly that's the place to start and see if anything in there is going to bother you. I would suggest that you can look at the manufacturer. What is their history? Are they the people that do the right thing? And that's probably going to provide you with the best information of whether the sealant you get is harmful to the environment, the future of the environment, or the inhabitants. Responsible manufacturers are going to care about you as the inhabitant, you as the builder, you as the guy that makes the material, you the guy that transports it, you the guy that cleans up, or you the guy that operates the landfill, or your grandkids. Responsible manufacturers produce responsible materials, and that probably is more evidence to whether what's in this container is going to harm the planet or the inhabitants. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. So next is Sharon Libby. And Sharon is a quality manager with Walsh Construction. She has a Bachelor of Architecture degree from U of O, University of Oregon, and worked in architecture for a while before making the switch to construction. She's with Walsh's quality department, has been there a little over 3 years. And she's involved with several projects. I actually have the privilege of working with her on one. And providing constructability reviews and field research during the pre-construction and the active construction phases. So, you know, she looks at concerns that are raised in the field, and that's a real motivator for her to research and solve problems. So she's going to give us some of that research, a study of sealants, and it's an example of kind of what works and what doesn't work. So Sharon.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks for willingly coming to listen to an hour or two about sealants. You're a little unique in that in the world. Would like to know a little bit more about you, and just maybe quickly, I don't mean to categorize anybody, but how many architects or designers are here? Okay, maybe people involved with green building products, either marketing or developing, or there we go. What about building envelope consultants or people who are working with that? Michael. What about builders? Lots of builders. Okay, did I miss anybody? Maybe lots of people. Okay, great. So again, I'm a quality assurance manager with Walsh, and in managing the quality process, we see building components and materials like sealants in design, in construction, and in service. And both project-specific material testing or testing on a large scale, which we did a large study about 3 years ago on sealants, really expands our knowledge in what we're working with every day. And so before I get into the study that we did, and I'm just really going to touch on that, I'd like to go over some basics, and starting with how sealants are used in construction. So I can, is it this one? Okay. So how sealants are used in construction, and from a basic building science perspective, looking at our 5 control layers, we have our bulk water shedding surface, water resistive control layer, air control layer, thermal control layer, and vapor control layer. And in each of these control layers, sealants really provide that connective tissue to connecting all the different elements of each layer. And why those need to be continuous is to really make sure we're keeping the outside out and the inside in. And so continuity of each of those layers is really key. Starting with our bulk water shedding surface, this is really our cladding. So anything from brick to a window or door, a metal parapet maybe up at the top of our parapet wall there. And where are the sealants? The sealants are going to be at those material interfaces and transitions. So maybe at a window perimeter or a door perimeter, or at a base of wall condition where it's connecting to a deck. Water resistive control layer, this is going to be your WRB. So sealants are usually located at penetrations, terminations, and transitions. So for example, if you have a hose bib pipe coming out of your wall, you're going to have sealant going around that to make your WRB continuous. Air control layer. Air control is one of the largest things that we look at in terms of sealants. And really in conjunction with sheet applied goods, whether it's mechanically attached or self-adhesive, but again, looking at those transitions and terminations, your laps, or connecting the materials to each other. Window and door air seals, and also interior air seals, maybe at your wall to ceiling, at party walls, or corridors. Thermal control layer, sealants aren't used too much, but a little in fire stopping. And vapor control layer used in conjunction with maybe a self-adhesive membrane that is serving multiple functions, your air, water, and vapor control. So maybe that's something like a vapor barrier on the top of your roof, and that would serve all of those functions. So again, why do we care about sealants? They're really providing that continuity of each of your control layers. And the penetrations, transitions, and terminations, all those interfaces that are coming together or poking through, disrupting that continuity, that's where we're using sealants mainly to make everything continuous. And so I'd say the two largest areas, there's going to be your WRB air barrier layer, and then also your water shedding or your cladding surface. So when we do constructability reviews and we're looking at sealants and design, we might look at see a drawing like this, and our sealants are going to be kind of in this form, little section of it, and this is a plan view of a window jamb. So here's your window frame here, and this exterior cladding sealant is connecting your window frame to that exterior cladding coming out from your window jamb. And then right here, a little bit harder to see the line work, but that's your interior air seal connecting this air barrier wrapping into the rough opening again to your window frame. And that detail is executed in this picture right here. And so if you can't see in the back there, this is this is the air seal coming down. Here's the strap anchor from the window, which is shown in drawing here. So of course we know everything looks a little bit different in the field than in the drawings, but even at this early stage we want to start asking ourselves what sealants we're using and what are some of their properties. Some of the things that we like to know about sealants are what's their exposure, what's their expected service life, and what's their purpose really. And so when we look at a drawing and a photo like this, we can see that this interior air seal, that's its purpose, to connect the air barrier all the way through from the WRB material here to the window frame. It's going to be completely covered up, so not exposed at all. We're going to have a window jamb wrap that covers that. However, this sealant wants to last as long as whatever it's attached to, right? So however long you expect your window to last, 20, 30 years, you want to be picking a sealant that lasts that long as well. Here's an exterior example of a storefront and a canopy condition. So over here is a detailed photo of this, where we can see the window, storefront window frame connecting to metal panel right here, and there's a sealant joint. Another sealant joint around where the canopy steel penetrates through the metal panel, and then yet another condition over here where the metal panel connects back to the concrete. So again, looking at those conditions of what's its exposure, what's its expected lifespan, and what purpose does it serve. So here we're at our cladding level. It's completely exposed, and I'm sure your owner wants to make sure it looks great. So we want to make sure that it can hold up to UV and any other weather that it's going to see, or any other environmental conditions that might be specific to your project. And also, you can get to this, so it is serviceable. However, the items that it's attached to are going to last quite a long time. So that's a question for your project. Does your owner want to service this every 5 years, or does it want to last as long as the metal panel and concrete? It is exposed, so you have that option. And so with all of that, we want to make sure that we're starting with the right materials, especially considering those factors. We have a saying at Walsh we call FMI. We have little stickers on our hard hats. FMI stands for Follow Manufacturer's Instructions. So we want to make sure we're executing the details as designed, but we also want to make sure we're using the right products and installing them as they were intended to be. So these are typical product data sheets from the manufacturer, and they provide us with a lot of good information, such as what the chemical makeup is. And Tom went over this a little bit, but some of the typical sealant chemistries: silicone, silyl terminated polyether, SCPE, polyurethane. And within those three categories, those are pretty general. Not all silicones are the same, even from the same manufacturer, and they're pretty general terms. When we get to something like polymer, which Tom explained as a basic plastic, or elastomeric, those are very, very general terms. So you have to think about what do these terms actually tell us about the sealants, and where a manufacturer is willing to give you a little more information on what the chemistry is, they're going to tell you a little bit more about it. If a sealant says elastomeric polymer, it tells you it's a stretchy plastic. So I don't know if that's good enough to put on your building or not. Approved substrates are usually listed in the data sheet, and usually they're just very simply listed out. And this is going to be all of the substrates that the manufacturer has tested and approves as okay to put their material on. Also some typical properties, and this is going to give you a little a bigger clue into the technical aspects of the sealants. So Tom listed a few ASTM tests, and these are all done under lab conditions by the manufacturer. And so it'll tell you some things. You can kind of dig through here and get some useful information out of it, though, even if you don't know what the ASTM is in particular. Joint movement capability is a good one, telling you how much it can move. Working time, cure time is a very practical thing to note. VOC content as well. So when we test as a general contractor, we're really looking for adhesion and compatibility, and I would say that those are the two ways that we see sealants fail the most, or we have challenges with. And this is a photo of an adhesive failure at the stucco line here. And this sealant joint was actually in service for quite a number of years, so it's an older one that we're looking at. But adhesive failure is where it's coming unstuck from the substrate. Cohesive failure, Tom went over a little bit, it's where it's failing within the sealant joint. You might see a crack down the middle. Substrate failure is really when the substrate that it's on is giving up. So maybe it's sealant on a wood trim that's rotting, or on a WRB that's maybe torn at the sealant line. Compatibility is another thing that we watch for, and that's really just if things are playing well together, as Tom described. So here's a great example of compatibility issue that we had on a project, and they're really occurring at some inadvertent material contact, because we do pre-construction testing on those designed sealants and substrates. So for this project at Mount Hood Community College in Oregon, we tested the sealant to the window frame and to the WRB for that interior air seal. However, when it was built, we noticed this, and that was the backing, asphalt backing on the self-adhesive membrane starting to dissolve and melt. So upon further examination, that's really what that looked like underneath, and it was all just running out of there and degrading. So our installer, who was doing the windows, decided to use the interior air sealant to put behind the flange of the window, and when that window was pushed into place, the sealant squished out from the flange and then was in pretty good contact with that asphalt backing of the post strap that went over and caused this to melt. So that is something we didn't plan for. It was a little extra sealant somebody applied to a spot they weren't supposed to put any on, and it resulted in the removal and reinstallation of 83 windows for us. So it's not a small thing. Inadvertent material contact can really throw a wrench in things, and we do a lot of testing to try to verify, and we do mock-ups. We try to learn from our experience and make sure we're sharing that knowledge within our company and within the professional community. We also try to expect the unexpected by looking at the drawings and in our mock-ups and try to guess of what might touch something else. We also do a lot of testing to verify the design materials, but to also try to discover some of the unknowns. So, any guesses on what this actually is, though?
Aliens?
Sorry? Aliens? No. So this is a wrench, and it was on the outside of a building, and it was holding a nut in place from this bolt that went through a concrete, or through this wall. And so the installer couldn't tighten it from the inside without something being held on the outside. So he put this wrench up here, put a little nail through it, went inside, tightened it, said, "It's fixed, it's good." So WRB crew comes along and they just went right over the top of it. Later discovered as what's that big lump. So this is what our typical this is what some of our typical testing looks like, and as we've mentioned a little bit, there was a larger study done about 3 years ago, and this was done several years ago with one particular sealant that was a new product that we wanted to test out on some different materials, and you can see it's being applied to a bunch of different self-adhesive membranes. This is part of a study board of that sealant test from 3 years ago, and you can see each 3 beads is a different sealant, and then that's on one particular substrate that we chose. And this is typically how we set up our very first pre-construction test of sealants. We lay a bead down that's probably an inch wide and maybe a half inch to a quarter inch thick. We tool that on there. This blue tape at the top is just painter's tape to provide us with a release tab. And then we do our pull test from there, which you'll see a little bit in another slide. We did 3 beads here. We did a pull test at 7 days, one at 14 days, and then we did some in-house training and demonstration pulls with this last one. And you'll notice that, this is just important for later in the presentation, that we went ahead and ran some of these sealants over the leading edge of this self-adhesive membrane. So this would be our next step of pre-construction testing, and you can see a pull test being done right here. But this is a piece, this white thing right here, that is a piece of window frame. And we just asked our window supplier to give us just a piece of the frame so we can test sealants on, and they're happy to provide that. This sealant right here is that exterior cladding seal, so that might go from the sealant to the trim. And then this right here is the interior air seal that would be connected to the WRB. And then again, this is the test in process. We're pulling that at a 90-degree angle and looking to make sure that it performs as the manufacturer has stated in the product data before it either breaks or comes loose from the substrate. And this is an in-service test. This particular photo is from a project that was done years previously. And you'll notice that there's 2 substrates here, whereas in the last slide there's only one, and in some of the previous slides there's only one. This test is an in-service test, and we also do this kind of test in construction, just to make sure that the materials we're using are continuing to perform as expected. How this test is done, it's cut down one side and pulled so that we're testing the adhesion on the opposite side, and then we just flip the side. So we cut down the other side and pull 90 degrees, and we're testing adhesion then on the brick side. So this is how we started our materials test that we did a few years ago. And I guess one disclaimer to all this is that, well, there's 2 disclaimers. One is that we do contractor grade testing. We don't own a lab. We don't clean our materials to lab condition. And usually the information you get on a product data sheet from the manufacturer will say right on it that testing is conducted at 70 degrees and 50% humidity. There's only a few days of the year that we even build in that kind of condition. So we like to do our testing, not in the pouring rain or anything, but with real conditions, whatever it is outside. Temperature, humidity levels, and then in terms of cleaning the substrates, we'll do just a dry wipe. We want to make sure we're keeping any other chemicals off of that, so we don't use any kind of cleaning facilitators or anything, but just a double clean white rag wipe is what we call it. So when we started our material testing, we looked at commonly specified sealants and substrates and put together a matrix. And we had all of our substrates kind of across the top. We had multiple pages of this, obviously. But we had WRBs, self-adhesive membranes, claddings, different window frame types. And then down the side here, we had different sealants, and we tried to group them by their chemistry: silicone, STPE, that elastomeric polymer, and the polyurethane sealants. And then we went through and looked at the product data sheets and looked at what we had in typical projects, what things go together. We also looked at some things that maybe they don't go together super often, but we've heard of it or seen it before. We also used primers if the manufacturer was recommending that. So in this whole study, there were over 600 pairings of sealant and substrates, and from that picture before, we did 3 pull tests on each one. 2 have recorded data, and you can get to this study and the report on our website, and I'll have a link at the end of the presentation. So here are some slides. I don't want to go over all the results, that would be a lot. So here's just some lesson learned about some of the things we were looking for. So here's a close-up of those sealant beads coming across the end of the the self-adhesive membrane. And this one in particular had a little strip of that asphalt exposed at the end of each of its roll. And what we observed, and here it is again, what we observed was, in general, most sealants did have some sort of reaction to that asphalt material, whether it was just simply discoloration but no physical movement or melting or anything, down to this one, which we have all of this material still, and we've been kind of watching it over years and starting to really drip down. So some sealants are going to be more affected by things than others. And one aspect of the test was that we did this in a matter of months. They weren't exposed to UV. And so some of your interactions on site might be more dramatic if you have bigger contact. But testing like this does give us at least a clue into what's going on. And if you see a little problem like this, you could certainly flip your membrane over and apply it more dramatically to see if that's going to be an issue, and then you'll know to keep those things away from each other, or if it's not a problem. Primers. If your manufacturer recommends a primer for a particular substrate, try it out. Try it in your testing. We found that, and this wasn't without exception, but they generally improved adhesion. And that's what they're supposed to do, and for most cases it worked. This was the one and only that didn't, and interestingly enough, the sealant and the primer stuck great together, but the whole primer and everything just came right off the substrate. So there are primers for certain substrates, and you might look into that if you find some kind of issue with your testing. This is a piece of primed cedar, and we had a few sealants that really leached the tannins out of it and started to discolor. And so that's another thing. And again, this is primed, so it has some kind of layer between it, but it still had that reaction. This is a liquid applied silicone WRB. And then the sealant on here is a polyurethane. And we know in general, when we get things of differing chemistries, just to watch out for that. That may be something that is good or not good. So we don't know how it's going to react. Different manufacturers, different chemistries. So what we observed in this was that the sealant really didn't want to be on the silicone, and to the point where it was slumping off to the side. It didn't even want to stack on itself. And then when we did the pull test, it just fell right off. So not good adhesive partners. This is a piece of brick here and a sealant applied over it. And really, this was kind of a setup because we've had this happen in the field, and we wanted to make sure that we showed everybody for demonstration purposes more than anything. But IPA, or isopropyl alcohol, is a common carrier for brick water repellents. It's also used a lot for cleaning a surface, maybe wiping down before you apply a sealant. If that IPA doesn't have time to flash off and dissolve, it can react with whatever you're putting on top of it. So in this case, what we did was we sprayed that IPA on the brick and immediately put sealant over top of it. And this is a silicone. The IPA is a cure inhibitor for silicones. So this picture was taken about 2 weeks after the sealant was applied, and it's still gooey and runny where it's in contact with that brick. So for a contractor, this kind of thing is a compatibility issue, but not something that we can't overcome. We just have to be knowledgeable about the materials we're applying. So if we have a brick water repellent that uses IPA, we need to know to let that flash off. And really, your manufacturer's data usually clues you into those kinds of things. Some will say they want sealants applied before their product is applied, or they want it applied afterwards. So, and always test. A piece of brick and a little sealant, and waiting 2 weeks is a lot cheaper than having to replace all the sealants on a building later. Bubbles are seemingly a common occurrence in sealants, or not too common, but maybe a common problem. We had a few instances of bubbling in our study, and oddly enough, they're usually a sign of air traveling through that sealant, and we couldn't really figure out where they were coming from. So they were on two not vapor permeable or air permeable products. So we think it may have been air in the tube or just an installation issue. Maybe it wasn't tooled properly. And it was very limited in where it was occurring. So we thought, okay, it's an anomaly and it didn't affect adhesion. In the field, we have seen bubbling, and I'd say this is probably the most common place that we see it, and it's where it's over a backer rod. And in fact, we see this on site. Here's a little bubble here and here, and it's kind of evenly spaced out. So what we found was that the installer used the wrong backer rod for this project. They used a closed cell backer rod, and when they pushed it into place with whatever pokey tool they happened to have, they punctured it. And the air that's trapped by those closed cells then escaped, and once the sealant was installed over it, that air coming out created these bubbles. So in this case, it is a performance issue because you're disrupting that hourglass shape that Tom showed you. And so you really need that shape for performance. And when you have a bubble interrupting that, that could affect your adhesion and your thickness of the sealant bead right at that location. Tom talked a little about solvinated sealants. So we had a few that were really highly solvinated, and I'd say a clue to figure out which ones of those are is that they're really stinky. And they off-gas a lot. And with that off-gassing, the ones that we were using tended to shrink. And you can see that by the wrinkling right here in the WRB that they were on. And it was causing wrinkling and puckering of all of those materials, the substrates. Surface coatings affect adhesion. So whether it's a surface coating on maybe a painted piece of wood or a metal panel that has a finish on it, down to product labeling on a WRB or a self-adhered membrane. What we found with this one is that it stuck really well to the black portions of this self-adhesive membrane, but it came right off where the ink was applied. So luckily there's not a whole lot of ink on this one, but just something to be aware of. Some of our conclusions that we went over or that we came up with at the end of our study, adhesion of sealants and substrates can change over time. If things are affected by UV or water, or if they're getting some other kind of exposure or some impact to them, that is one thing. Also, when we did our 7-day pull test and our 14-day pull test, we started to see differences in adhesion and compatibility from those times. In general, the adhesion increased, but it wasn't always that way. Coatings and primers can have important effects on adhesion. And similarities in basic chemistries and substrates tended to aid adhesion. So if you had silicone to silicone or STPE to STPE, polyurethane to polyurethane, again, that's not without exception, but that was a general conclusion. Recommended cure times are dependent on sealant's exposure to proper environment, and a lot of sealants require air and moisture to cure. So if you look at that product data sheet again, 70 degrees, 50% humidity, we don't have that a lot. So if you have a 40-degree day with 60% humidity, your sealant may take a little bit longer to cure. Non-specific product labeling, such as polymer or elastomeric, or even where it says proprietary and they're just upfront with you, we're not going to tell you what's in this, is a little difficult. It makes it difficult in understanding how the product's going to work. It kind of takes away all your lessons learned and your rules of thumb, and now you're just trusting what's in the tube. So you can always push back on that. Sometimes the tube says something a little bit different than your product data sheet, so take a look and ask your manufacturer. Test early and test often, and it's really important to use your project-specific materials. So that's the other disclaimer to the study. It was done 3 years ago. I'm sure there's been multiple changes to every product that we used, and so you want to test your project-specific materials to make sure that the performance is going to be what you expect as well as what the manufacturer tells you. The report, here's the link for the report. You can take a look at that, and it has all the test board photos and other slides. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
Yeah, a lot of testing is done, but how about the health of the product? How healthy are they? I mean, it's been a
So one thing that, as a general contractor, safety is really first. So I guess I'll start with our workers. And whether they're our own employees or they are installers and subcontractors that we're using, one of the biggest thing that, for both the performance of the sealant but also for the health of the worker, is don't use your finger to tool sealants. For the performance of the sealant, we don't want to impart any dirt or whatever was on your finger at lunchtime. We don't want that on our building, and it doesn't work with the chemistry, whatever it is. But also, we don't want that, whatever that chemistry is, we don't want that affecting our workers. So the other part to that, I would say, is a lot of our buildings and a lot of the design teams we work with use green building standards. And those green building standards are going to have different requirements for the sealants, and the one biggest thing is probably a VOC content.
So is CARB 2, CARB 1, the Japanese method, European standards, does that come into play in any of these?
I am not familiar with that. Are you familiar with that at all? I'm not familiar with that. Most of the green building standards that we're looking at are LEED and Evergreen standard. In Oregon, we're looking at Energy Star and Earth Advantage.
And living building challenge.
And Living Building Challenge. Any other questions? Go ahead.
It feels like you've done a tremendous amount of work and research, and in this case, you've willingly published that publicly. But there's probably, I'm assuming, many companies that are keeping that information proprietary. I was wondering if there are any efforts to share more widely and maybe use a general rubric of test procedures
Of testing.
and publishing that, like we take pictures of this quality or
Mhm.
this in a report, and then kind of collaboratively share more
Sure.
of this information, get more of it out, so people don't have to duplicate to that extent every single time, especially for a smaller organization who wouldn't have the resources. And I was wondering, does that exist, or is that an opportunity?
It's probably more of an opportunity than a database that you'll be able to find. There are, the product manufacturers have their data sheet, and there are, so there's, can I back up on this, or
Don't like, you want to go?
further? A lot further, keep going. Keep going. So some of the testing that we do in field, keep going. Right there. This is actually an ASTM test, and I'm not sure if it's listed on every product manufacturer's data sheet, but the ASTM material or test data would be on their data sheet. So you could take that and compare it, but again, that's not going to be in field performance. You can always ask about it, and that's one thing that we do ask when people you had asked about new products come to us. We're happy to entertain and research new products. A lot of times we say, what's your proven what's your proven in-field performance? What's your history? And we want to use products that are proven. And so if that means it's not the newest product, we're okay with that. We'd rather put that on a mock-up or test it on our own than put it on someone else's building. In the back.
What brands or products have you guys found yourself using?
Whatever our architect specifies. And tests well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just say that anecdotally, we have some experience where a manufacturer will say that their product is adequate for a certain use or something, and that the actual testing turns out to be something less than that. So, I mean, I think where the rubber really meets the road is in actually testing.
So there was I asked about product reps or building people with green building. How many people are there here? A few? So as you know, a lot of companies will have a salesperson and a technical person. Sometimes, and it's great when this happens, they're the same person. And so when you talk to them as a builder, giving you technical information, and you want that information related to your client, then it's the same. Some companies have a very big distance between those people, and so I would just caution you to ask the question. You know, and like Tony said, you can always look at the product data sheet and ask the sales guy, you know, if he's knowledgeable in those things. And if that person isn't, they might say, oh, you need to talk to this other person or whatever. But sometimes there's a big difference. Anything to add in the back there?
I was raising my hand, but I would say engineers are usually lonely and love phone calls. We've gotten a lot of information by just calling and harassing the engineers.
Great. Go ahead.
I had a question for Tom.
Oh,
So in joint design, I'm covered through testing for adhesive capabilities, and I'm more worried about potential cohesive failure in a joint. With thermal expansion and contraction, what's going to put more stress on that joint? Is it in elongation, or is it in compression of that joint?
I don't know how many of you heard what he was asking. He's asking, in that elongation measurement, what is more destructive to the sealant? Is it when it's compressed or when it's elongated? And in our testing, we find, regardless of the technology or the polymer used, it's going to fail under compression more often. The forces are multiplied as the material is compressed, and you've got incredible forces against the adhesion. You have much more likelihood of substrate failure, and you have activities going on that typically aren't built into the product. I mean, we all look at how far they stretch, and sealants are classified by their ability to compress and stretch. And that compression number is probably the most critical, because that's likely where it's going to fail. It's going to, as the materials come together, the sealant's got to go somewhere, and that's why that joint design, the geometry of the design is so critical, and not just in testing, but going back up on into the field and looking and making sure that that joint, you know, it started out half an inch, and as we all know, windows go into out of square, out of plumb, non-dimensionally correct openings. So we might have an 1/8 inch gap at the top and an inch at the bottom. We have to make sure that that joint is thick and as wide as it should be to allow for that material to stretch, but also that there's room in there, and that's why that hourglass shape is so critical, because it gives that sealant somewhere to go when the substrates start to come together. Does that answer your question?
Tom, there's a question for you there, and do you want to come back over?
Yeah, come on up in front of the microphone here.
The question was, what about the UVB breakdown of caulk? If you Google Saturday Night Live and caulk, there is a tremendous clip that you'll learn all about caulk. As it relates to this discussion, UV is the spectrum of light just beyond what our eyes see. Just the other side of magenta and purple is UV. Just on the other end, the shorter or the longer end is IR. We don't see that either, but it's electromagnetic radiation that happens, and it's a force that has an effect on our sealants. UVB, as opposed to UVA, is particularly destructive to some polymers. And I think there was a little bit of confusion in one of the slides, mine versus one of Sharon's. Some of the sealants are labeled polymeric. They're all polymeric. They're all polymers. All plastics are polymers. Polymer means many into one. You're taking a whole bunch of individual little pieces that are in this container, and as you squirt it out and it gets exposed to the atmosphere, the moisture in the atmosphere, or the oxygen, or whatever the curing mechanism, There's typically an agent in there that once it's exposed to the air, it's going to introduce all those parts and they become one. That's the curing process, or the cross-linking process. They are all polymers. When they say polymeric on the tube and use it as a generic term, they're saying it's goo. And if goo is going to work for you, then buy it. It's cheap. And it likely has solvents and things they don't want to talk about in it. And if you're building a movie set, use it. But if you're building a building that people are hoping to invest money in and get a return on that investment, you need to look at precise things like we've both been talking about tonight. The term caulk comes from the boating industry, actually. And it started out when we made boats out of planks and recognized that the different shapes and the different thicknesses where the planks came together, there was gaps, and that's where water comes in and how boats sink. So they would pound rope in there, and then they would put tree pitch over the top of that, and that was caulk. And that became what we now call sealants. They were sealants. They weren't incredibly effective, but they kept boats from sinking, and they determined that, okay, this tree works better than that tree, and then they found tar, and tar worked better, lasted longer. But the term caulk is a generic term. It doesn't mean as much as sealant. See, when people talk about caulks or putties or goo or sealant. Sealant is a more specific term generally used in the structural sealant realm or in the construction industry. UV breakdown, again, it's UV. It is the range of electromagnetic radiation that attacks bonds. And some bonds are more durable, typically SI, silicone, silica, the element, it can be, silicon is the element. Silicone is a polymerized element of silicon. Silica is a crystalline form of the same thing. So that means nothing to you as far as sealants go. But that SI bond is incredibly strong, and UVA and UVB do not affect it. And that's why silicone polymers last a very long time, and they are probably the most durable polymer. They don't bond well to wet substrates, so there's places you can't use them. They aren't all just silicone. They are carboxylated silicone. They're acrylamized silicone. There's different levels of silicone, as Sharon mentioned. So that bond, how strong it is. And you think of Velcro. It's a tiny little hook, and you have a hook on this side, and they're incredibly weak. But if you have millions of them, you can't get them apart. And that's those bonds that take place with both adhesion that's attaching that sealant to the substrate as well as the sealant to itself. And UV shining on it and the heat that it creates accelerates the effect of that UV snapping those bonds. And that's why they turn back into goo, they turn into liquid, they fall out of the crack, they chalk, they bubble, they do all those things because of both UVA and UVB. And it's just strictly UV. Attack is what's doing it, accelerated, especially if you spray water on it, you're gonna multiply that effect and cause the material to break down even faster.
Another question there.
I guess one conclusion I'm coming to is whenever possible, at least a remodel or something, if you could avoid using a sealant and just go with some kind of shingling principle as your default. I mean, I know you can't do that all the time, but if, like how they've replaced the joints on hardy plank with a piece of flashing instead of trying to caulk that seam.
Correct.
And the corners, you don't use a corner board, you put that metal.
Absolutely.
So is that like,
and that is a way to manage water. Typically, it's a water issue. It's not going to be an air issue. You don't have, it's not structurally adhered to one and structurally adhered to the other and providing no place for air to get up underneath it or beyond. If things are shingled properly, you're gonna have water management. And if the water doesn't get deep enough or the snow stack up and melt and get underneath it, you're fine. But if you're looking for air protection, that typical shingling, Z-metal or anything else like that isn't gonna stop air.
I'd really look at your control layers and which
Yeah.
control layer you're looking at. So cladding, your water shedding surface, not every single joint needs to be covered to be continuous, but it doesn't need to be sealed with sealant. So the lapping principle on your exterior claddings definitely works, as long as you don't have some kind of open joints that then, make it not continuous. But at your air level, where you're wanting to seal that completely, air can go up as well as down when water generally goes down, right? So I'd say those principles.
Mike?
Why would Hardy, I hope the guy's not in the room, but why would Hardy get away from that sealant in that joint? Why? Because for a long time they were pushing that, and now.
Go ahead.
So the question was, why would a fiber cement siding company get away from sealing between planks versus using a lapping method of putting a metal shingle behind? There's been developments in their product, but also in how different materials work together and age on a building. And it's a very tedious process to go through and seal all those joints. Frankly, it's a better solution. It lasts longer. And we're also, they've really provided other means and methods for sealing their cut ends of the fiber cement panel. So with a paint primer and paint sealing that end. Some of it's practicality. If you look at a lot of the projects we do, our owners are more interested in serving who's in their building than they are making sure every little sealant joint is kept up every 3 years. So providing this other method that adds longevity makes their product a little more attractive, in that the maintenance is less.
Question for Tom. In the end of your talk, you talked about, judging which are the good companies, that we have a good fortune with that. And we, us small builders here, most of us know your company already. And we can go through and check the green label companies, the companies that commonly show up there. But what about when we come across, at the lumberyard, a sealant that at least sounds good, but we don't know anything about the company? It's a good way to get a feel for a company like that.
That's what makes groups like this so important. You can come here and ask, you can just stand up like you just did, and somebody in here may have already used that product and had a good experience with it. Somebody else may have had a bad experience. Maybe it was used in the wrong application. But groups like this, where we come together like-minded, we're all after longer lasting, healthier buildings that we feel more proud to have had anything to do with. It's groups like, that's the importance of these groups and the relationships that we build as we become members and active within these communities. If you're all detached and nobody talks, then you are at the absolute mercy of those manufacturers. As you get together and share information, then the manufacturers have to be more careful. And the manufacturers that show up to groups like this or support groups like this are the ones that are willing to recognize, okay, bad things happen to all of us. How many of us are willing to go make it well? If I know that somebody's going to apply my product wrong, or the guy making it may have had a bad day, or I may have left something out of the formula. But there's groups that are willing to show up and say, it was bad and I'm sorry, what can we do to fix it? Those are the groups that you want to look for, and somebody likely in here has experience with those manufacturers that can point you in the right direction.
Michael, to that question about the hardy plank and the joints, I asked that question to a hardy plank rep one time, and what he said is actually when they started closing and buttoning them is when they started color coding them and they were priming the hardy plank, so it was like pretty much painted all around, so concrete absorbs moisture, so that sealed it off. But what he didn't say, or what the reason they changed that is because a lot of the people would cut the hardy plank, but they wouldn't seal the ends. And so, when they were document that was a solution to seal those ends when they cut them before the paint. And so even though they paint them and they say you can butt them, once you cut that, if you don't paint it, you're back to.
All bets are off.
And don't quote me on this, it's just like what he told me.
Right.
Question in the back?
Sharon and Tom, Tom, you talked about how sealants fail, and you talked about these $4 million rehabs, and then Sharon, you talked about how with sealant continuity and the water shedding surface is not absolutely critical. And I think it's important to put those two statements in context of what's the underlying assembly. You know, that the sealant as a water shedding surface is okay as long as you have an assembly that can handle it when it fails. So, you know, what's been your experience in dealing with that?
Go ahead.
Okay, so in an exterior cladding seal, let's just say the sealant that would go in between your window frame and a trim piece, that is going to be a performance, what we call a performance or movement joint, and it should have the do you have some of those slides up again? Do you have?
Well, my question is, how critical is it if that sealant fails? What happens? Where
Okay.
does water go?
So we want that sealant not to fail, and we've done a bunch of things to make sure, or to hope that it is in place for as long as we've expected to. When it does fail at that exterior cladding surface, we're building buildings with a drainage plane behind that, so a rain screen. And so that's our fail-safe. We really don't want to introduce water into that from the get-go, but if it does fail, that there's a drainage plane for that to come out. Now, the sealants that are back at your air barrier, and a lot of times we use air and water-resistant barriers are two different concepts, very different, but they can be accomplished with the same material. And so when they are, we want to make sure that the sealants at that level are in place and sealed. That's something that's back behind the cladding, so it's not something that you can see, that you can service, that you can replace. So I guess if a sealant fails at, or not very easily anyways, if a sealant fails at that exterior cladding surface, you have the opportunity to review it, to look at it. It also has the opportunity to drain out. If something gets behind your WRB or your air barrier, you're now introducing that into the interior of your wall assembly. And that's where you have moisture sensitive materials. So that's where your framing is versus your vinyl window or your borate treated furring strip. So that's kind of the line at inside and outside that you're looking at. Any other comments?
Well, I would add, and I think that it would be pertinent to any discussion like this, as to what's in the future. What are we going to do to address some of these issues that we find, no matter how hard we try to seal everything up? And when I ask builders, how good are your guys? What grade would you give them with their air barrier? And I've never had one say an A+. They'll say B+, A-. I've never heard anybody say D or F. And I have to remind them, a balloon is only a balloon if it's 100%. It's got to be an A+. Even a tiny, tiny hole in that balloon, and all bets are off. You don't have an air barrier anymore. That's how critical it is that that air barrier remain completely continuous. With my partner's experience, 25 years of tearing apart well-intentioned, very expensive buildings, water happens. It just does. And regardless of how much training, how much information we can provide, how much supervision there is on the job site, there will be a day, Thursday evening at 5:30, floor up on the scaffolding, that somebody makes a decision that compromises that air and water barrier. Water simply happens. And we've been denying that fact for too long. We denied that windows leak for way too long. Now we kind of assume they do, so we flash them accordingly. We have to recognize that buildings leak, and they always are going to leak. We cannot afford to build a building that does not absolutely ever going to leak. So the next step in the construction industry is to recognize that and engineer into the wall assembly a way for it to dry. To pick materials that are not going to absorb that moisture, or if they do, they're not going to degrade, and then use If you have a super tight building, you might be able to use your range hood, for instance, to provide positive pressure to drive dry air through the assembly that's going to dry it back out. You may have sensors within the wall systems underneath the window that go ding, 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 turn on the fans, and it blows dry air through the assembly and dries it back out before the materials reach a moisture level where they start to mold, degrade, and cause loss and failure and unhealthy conditions. I believe that's where we're headed. We will have engineered drying attached, built into our wall assembly. And when that happens, we'll have 100-year buildings. We'll have 200-year buildings like we used to. We used to have engineered drying because they leaked so bad. Air came in and went out at will, and they dried. And now we sealed them up and never accounted for that water that is going to happen. And you're hearing it here first. We're involved in looking at what materials. When we sealed up all the holes, all of a sudden now we're creating diffuse airflow through plywood, gypsum, OSB, and all of our materials that never used to happen. All air carries water, and we're measuring the amount of water that OSB and plywood collect as a 10-mile-an-hour wind is held against it. How fast does it go to 18% or critical moisture content? I can turn the humidifier on and dry that material back out. Can we engineer or incorporate or integrate a system that maintains a dry wall? And that's great if you're looking at for costs of repair and the mold issues, but if that wet air is getting into your wall assembly, your super insulated wall is now a thermal conductor. So it's more critical than just the degradation of the materials. It is for that high performance to remain high performance. It's only high performance if it dries. We're only taking these measurements the day we hand over the keys. I think it would behoove us to go back and measure some of these buildings 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. At the very least, look at the energy consumption, the electricity bills. And it will come down to address your question, our ability to admit we can't keep the water out and build in a drying mechanism into the design of the wall system. And we will save money and time and headaches and health and energy and everything else once we start doing that.
Another question there?
Well, yeah, I was expecting something you can address or not as a building envelope question. But there's this push, especially in Seattle, for super, super airtight buildings. I mean, you're required to do blower tests now, and you have to have, built-in ventilation into your windows with the idea that nobody's ever going to open their window. No passive ventilation or built-in passive ventilation. And so one of the issues that we're concerned about where I work is that with these super airtight buildings, you can't get the water out. The water always comes in, air carries water, and it's and we feel like these buildings are often just sort of set up to fail because there are penetration issues like even outlet boxes and stuff like that, or a sealant seam at sort of two walls coming together in a corner. If that's missing, then suddenly you don't have a totally airtight home anymore and everything fails. So we're being pushed to do this for energy standards, and yet we don't really have the technology. I'm not sure we have the technology to actually make those systems work. Is there something that we can do, like spray and foam insulation instead of that, for example, to kind of maybe make these systems work, or is there not?
You're bringing up a whole bunch of questions that lead to about 20 times more questions than that, and they are incredibly valid, good questions that you bring up. And that is, are we sealing these buildings up and designing failure? Yes, we are. Is there technology available to keep that happening from happening? Yes, there is. Are we in a process of getting there? Yes, we are. And it isn't near as fast as I would hope or the general public can afford, But we are on a path, we're doing our blower door test. There isn't even any specification to meet with that blower door. We're just kind of finding out where we are as far as air tightness. And that air tightness is absolutely critical important. And if I asked in here, okay, how much airflow do we need in a building? Everybody would have a different answer. And I could supply you with drill bits to meet each of those answers, right? And that is ludicrous to say I need X amount of air, so I'm going to drill a hole somewhere in the building. I need to seal it all tight, and now I can decide how much air I need and where it's going to come from. I can manage the air once I'm controlling it. If I've got gaps and holes, I have no control over that air, and I'm at the mercy of where it's coming from, where it's coming in. If it's coming in, it's going out, and both places are degrading. So if we do make every effort to make it sealed up tight, now we can manage that air. We can bring in dry air if it's drier outside, or we can push dry air if it's drier inside through that assembly to dry it out. And it gets back to that idea, and I honestly believe that's where we'll end up, engineered drying. We'll figure out ways to incorporate even the stack effect, those pressures, to dry the buildings out, and it will be cheap and long lasting. I hope that attempts to answer the question.
So, thanks, both of you. I think we probably need to wrap this up, but maybe you guys would be willing to informally answer some questions afterwards? Sure. Yeah. So, thank you all for coming. I want to point out our sponsors again. We've got 475 back there in the corner. We've got King County Green Tools, and we've got Green Home Solutions. And there's also a sign-up sheet at the volunteer table back there, if anybody's interested in volunteering. There's a note here about a workshop, Tom? Is that? No.
Actually, question, Tom.
Question.
And this is for Sharon and Tom. Tom mentioned when he first started that we're really going to be brushing the surface and that. A question for you, if our audience and others are interested in, say, a one-day workshop, so you can really get in and dig into this and applications and that type of thing, would there be an opportunity that you would be interested in following this up?
Absolutely, and I think that the group at Walsh could combine with us where we could bring materials in and demonstrate how they're applied, why they perform, why they fail, and I think that would be a great day.
Okay, so with that, as we're leaving, if you do have that interest, we've got a sign-up sheet here, and if we can put that together, that's the direction of our education committee. How do we build these into an in-depth opportunity, and we can further our learning, and we can help teach from what we've learned.
So you'd be willing to name names in that kind of a setting?
For the right amount of beer. There you go.
Okay, just remember Saturday Night Live call. Thanks again.